I'll tell you my favorite verse in the book of Lamentations, since you didn't ask.
Yeah. What is your favorite verse?
Habitu uru'u im yesh machov kemach'ovi.
Yeah.
Look and see if there is any pain like my pain. That is an expression of a person in the grip of absolute grief. There's never been a pain like this pain.
Yeah.
Now here's what I want to say. Yesh mach'ov kemach'ovi. There is pain like my pain. And there are individuals who, in the specificity of their pain and grief, can find a way of identifying with the pain and grief of the other, including, and we have to say this, pain and grief that we were agents of, that we caused.
Welcome back to the Pluralist Podcast from both sides of the ocean. I'm Orly Erez-Likhovski, Executive Director of the Israel Religious Action Center.
And I'm Rabbi Josh Weinberg, Vice President for Israel and Reform Zionism for the URJ and Director of ARTSA. Today we are recording on July 21st, the 7th day of the month of Av, sitting here on the campus of the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem in the office of Rabbi Michael Marmur. It's an honor to be with you in person.
Yes, so great to be able to record some sessions in person and not through Zoom. I think today we're going to talk about Tisha B'Av and what it asks us of in an age of Jewish sovereignty and power. Tisha B'Av has traditionally been a day of mourning for the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, the Jewish national life. But today, Jerusalem has been rebuilt and we have a Jewish state. So what are we really mourning? We want to ask what it means to speak about sinat chinam, baseless hatred, religious zealotry, destruction, and rebuilding in the reality we are living through today. How can Tisha B'Av help us recognize the dangers of extremism, dehumanization, and moral certainty in our time? And how can we make space for Jewish grief and fear while also confronting suffering caused or enabled by Jewish power?
And really no better person to do that with than, of course, Rabbi Professor Michael Marmur. In addition to, I'll say on a personal note, being my teacher and rabbi and someone who I continue to learn through, from whom I continue to learn every opportunity that I can. Rabbi Marmur is a theologian, an educator, a teacher, a writer, and an activist who has spent decades shaping Reform Judaism in Israel and around the world. I'll give your official bio just so that our listeners have it, that Rabbi Marmur is the former provost of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion and previously served as dean of its Jerusalem campus. He has written and taught extensively about Jewish theology, liberal Judaism, religious responsibility, and the role of Jewish ideas in public life. Some of his books include Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Sources of Wonder. He edited a book with the late Rabbi Professor David Ellenson, American Jewish Thought since 1934, Writings on Identity, Engagement, and Belief, and recently, Living the Letters, an alphabet of emerging Jewish thought. Okay, and just as of late, hot off the presses, as we can say, a book that you edited with Professor David Myers from Los Angeles called The Challenges of Sovereignty, Essays on Israel and Zionism, bringing together the essays and writings of David Ellenson on these topics. So it's a very fitting time to be talking about those things. And I should add also that in addition to your academic and HUC positions, you are also a past chairperson of Rabbis for Human Rights here in Israel. Rabbi Marmur, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and thank you for hosting us here in your office.
It is a great pleasure. It's always amusing to hear a long introduction about Tisha B'Av and then to hear who better to talk on the subject than Michael Marmur. I don't want, your listeners and viewers to get the impression that I am the go-to person for mourning,
destruction,
sorrow, destruction and pain.
Yes.
I'm interested in other topics as well, but I'm happy to be talking with you.
Well, I think that we want to use this conversation to really talk about the future and to talk about how we should be thinking about these things as Jews, as liberal Jews, as Reform Jews, as those who take the lessons of our past seriously in order for them to inform our future, and to think about what should we be doing about that. And of course, the question of Zionism, as Orly stated, what does it mean to be living here in a modern day Jerusalem when there may still be some issues yet to solve in the modern state of Israel and around the world.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk
Yeah.
about pain and destruction, but of course, as a way of getting out of it to a better future, obviously. And so, Michael, really thank you for being with us. And before we turn to Tisha B'Av and other issues, we want to ask you start with you telling us a little bit about your journey. How did you become a Reform rabbi, and dealing with research and teaching, and what led you to also be involved in Jewish activism?
A perfect preparation for a discussion on Tisha B'Av. Something about my biography. I'm in the family business. I was born into a rabbinic family. My father, the late Rabbi Dov Marmur, would always like to say when people would ask him, "Do you come from a distinguished rabbinic family?" He would say, "No, but my children do." So I was born into such a family in England. That's where I picked up this accent, and came to Israel after my undergraduate studies in the mid-1980s. I originally thought about going on to HUC in North America, in the United States, but in the course of my first year here, decided that I was going to stay. Sarah, who became my wife, was then the love interest. She came out a year later from England, and we've been here ever since. Essentially, I was ordained from the Israeli program of the college. Worked for 6 years at the Liobek Education Center in Haifa as the rabbi of Orly Avraham congregation, and also teaching high school and on the executive committee of that great institution. And then was asked to come back here to this place. So one way or the other, I've been, it's very hard to find your way around this campus, and I've actually been stuck here since 1984. I'm sure I'll find a way out eventually. In my area of particular academic interest is indeed Jewish thought, Jewish theology. I wrote a doctorate on the thought of Abraham Joshua Heschel, which was later turned into a book. Sadly, not yet a movie, but who knows? It could happen.
I hear Netflix is interested.
There's some interest, but there's been some issues with the casting. We haven't yet got down to it. And in the course of the years, I've taught in all of the programs here at the college, and been very involved in trying to develop the Israeli dimension of what HEC does. At the same time, hosting a wave upon wave of students, education, cantorial, rabbinic students who come in from over there and have spent the first year of their studies with us. So that's more or less the kind of broad sweeps of the story. I'm married to Sarah, who's the executive director of the Rossing Center for Education and Dialogue. We have 3 adult children. We have 1 grandchild. That's more or less who we are.
And you are dealing not only with research and teaching, but you are involved in Jewish activism, I would call it. And you served as the chairperson of Rabbis for Human Rights, and you still serve on the board. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What led you to deal with that alongside your academic interests? And
yes, absolutely. Well, I would say that I am in the world of activism, I am in this sort of good cup of coffee, comfortable armchair school of activism. There are many of my colleagues are out on the barricades a lot more than I am, but I think it's important, very important to be as involved as one can in the ways that one can. When I was the provost of HUC, which means I was the chief academic officer for the school across its different campuses. And during those years and the years before, when I was the dean of the college here, I couldn't really be too overtly involved in at the time, but I also wasn't quite appropriate institutionally. And when I stepped down from those roles in 2018, I knew that this was an opportunity for me to get more involved. And since that time, I've been very engaged with Rabbis for Human Rights. I came in as the chair, and one of the first things we did was hire Avi Dabush as the director of Rabbis for Human Rights, and I've worked very closely with Avi over the years. That's an interesting.
You mentioned that Avi, of course, now secured a relatively impressive place on the Democratic list after the primaries took place yesterday.
Yes, that's certainly true. And I would say, look, rabbis for human rights itself is an interesting story. A group of rabbis, perhaps none more prominent and influential amongst them at the beginning than the late David Foreman, in the 1980s here in Israel, thought that it was impossible that in their understanding of their own Judaism, not to lean in to some of the most complicated and controversial questions. It was most particularly to do in the wake of the Intifada with the way in which we see and don't see the Palestinians around us. And over the years, the organization expanded. Another graduate of our institution, Arik Asherman, was for many years the director of the. It's still amazing. He hasn't worked in Rabbis human rights for years, but people still his name has enormous recognition. So alongside the issue of the rights of Palestinians as expressed in the West Bank and elsewhere, there was also, as the organization developed, a strong emphasis on questions of social justice within Israel, food insecurity, poverty. We have a civil rights kind of center, a walk-in center in the Hadera area. And we've been involved a lot in education, working with generations of kids in Mechina and pre-army programs. It's a small, busy organization. The last very bracing and difficult years here in Israel have been awful for Israel. They have brought a lot of the work of organizations like RHR into the light.
Yeah.
And so we are in some ways busier than we've ever been. It is a Sisyphean struggle. You're only ever pushing the rock a tiny way up before it crushes you on its way down. But you ask why I'm involved in it. I'm involved in it because the alternative seems so much worse, which is just, there's a famous Talmudic expression in Tractate Ta'anit, that you shouldn't sit in your home and say, Shalom Alecha Nafshi, I'm all right, Jack.
Yeah.
Everything's okay. I sit in this office quite often thinking how wonderful my life is, but that's not an appropriate Jewish response. So RHR is my way of trying to look out beyond the confines of my own book-lined study.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of similarities with, what Arik is doing in RHR, really about raising the Jewish voice against injustice, and where
there's been a lot, and there's a lot of, we hire each other's people. We work in tandem on a lot of projects. It's the same, in a sense, family.
Yeah.
One of the things you should say about Rabbis for Human Rights is that it is not denominational in a particular way. There is a disproportionate number of Reform rabbis who have been involved in the organization over the years. And it's a question, fascinating things are happening in the Orthodox world now, as there are folks who are who feel called to respond to the moral call of the hour. Some of them do so within RHR. Others, the small and new initiatives. If you look away from the question of particular institutional interests, all of these initiatives have to burgeon and flourish and cooperate because the challenges are so immense.
But I think it's also an overlap of ideology and values at the end of the day. And I think that one of the things that we want to get into, especially in the discussion of Tisha B'Av, zealotry, and what led to this churban, this destruction, is that this weird phenomenon that we've seen, I think it's not new in Israel, of course, that the more religiously observant someone is, the more hawkish they might be, or the less sensitive they might be to the rights of the capital O other. A number of years ago, someone asked me, they were worried that Rabbis for Human Rights were too critical and giving a bad name to Israel abroad. And someone asked me, what do you think of Rabbis for Human Rights? And I said, well, I'm much more concerned with rabbis who don't care about human rights. And so, so I think that is there's an overlap there, and that we're all looking at this moment to say, well, what are we called to do? And which sources do we choose to highlight in that are compelling for us and are calling us to act, essentially? And so let's put that in the context of Tisha B'Av. First, would you would you be willing to share with us what is your Tisha B'Av practice? Here we are. You're living in Jerusalem for now decades. Do you have a minhag that you do on Tisha B'Av, or is it different each year, or does it?
Yes, my Tisha B'Av practice is fairly set. I usually in my community am involved in lamentations. It's interesting. Seems to be the time of the year in our congregation where people bring out. Well, in the old days, people used to bring out flashlights of various kinds. Now they just use their telephone, and as I've got older, my capacity to sit, the stools on which I sit are getting higher as time is passing.
Yes, yes.
But no, there is that kind of ritual dimension. I wrote an article, I just dug it out. I was looking at it in 2013, called Why I Will Be Fasting This Year.
Mm.
And, just to say a word about that from a historical point of view, it is interesting to note that Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Judah the Patriarch, the great, the redactor of the Mishnah, early 3rd century, according to rabbinic sources, tried to discontinue Tisha B'Av.
Mm.
And he did so on the basis that there's now sovereignty, and we're now, or not exactly sovereignty in his day, but things are doing pretty well for the Jews. He was well in with the Roman Empire, and there was a period of relative
He was
peace.
looking at Galileo, right? in the
He
north.
believed that there was a kind of messianic thing unfolding, and that it was no longer necessary. And in essence, he was overruled. The folk, the people, were not prepared to give up on. And you
looking back and mourning.
and looking back on
remembering.
mourning, and perhaps they were less convinced than he was that the period of our mourning was over, indefinitely, and
Redemption had not yet come.
happy days are here again, and it's all we're just marching forward towards a bright new tomorrow. But Yehuda Anasi, not usually pegged as a Reformed Jew, was an early example of somebody who thought we don't need to do this anymore, and many followed that lead, thinking that the whole business of the elaborate choreography of mourning, all that stuff, not brushing your teeth and not eating
Fasting.
and all that, fasting and refraining, this was so far away. And in the article I wrote, I gave 6 reasons why I would be fasting that year. So I was interested to know what my 6 reasons had been.
Whether they're still relevant these days,
Yeah.
13 years later.
And so I wrote, here's the headlines. I'm not going to recite the whole thing.
We can put a link to it in the notes,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yeah, if I can dig it up somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It's probably in the Jerusalem Post or something. Who
Yeah.
can remember? Anyway, it doesn't matter. I said, first of all, that I'd be fasting this Tisha B'Av because I take Jewish tradition seriously. And for the 20 centuries or so, this has been a day that has resonated in our tradition. And simply saying, well, that's it, I'm done, is not quite the way I approach thinking about my relationship to tradition. I wrote, because I do not want to cede the monopoly on mourning and lamentation to fanatics and literalists. That I don't want to suggest that there's 2 groups within the Jewish people: those who are, sitting on the floor and wailing and gnashing their teeth, and then everybody else who's at the mall.
Yeah.
That I'm not sure that I want to buy into that rather easy dichotomy. That I would rather be part of a process which is claiming these aspects. I wrote, thirdly, because I need to be reminded of what I take for granted. My own parents, survivors, knew hunger well as children, but that's never been part of my experience. And it's always interesting to see how in Jewish society, certainly in Israel, the days on which we fast, the kind of general panic that sets in, is no doubt triggered by some sort of group
collective memory.
collective memory
trauma.
anxiety.
Yeah.
The same people who get so anxious about, if you tell them that they're on a special diet of waiting,
Intermittent fasting.
if you say
Yeah.
it's an intermittent, oh, well, that's totally fine. That's okay. If you can put on your sweats while you're doing it, then everything's fine. But the idea that I'm going, so
But Tisha B'Av is a different kind of fast than Yom Kippur. That's
Abraham Joshua Heschel once said about the difference between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. He said that on Tisha B'Av, the question that you really ask yourself is, who can eat? When you think about all of the awful suffering and grief and history and mourning, who can eat? And on Yom Kippur, the question is, who needs to eat? That if you put yourself in a place where you're emphasizing the spiritual dimensions of your life, you can sort of step away. So
isn't it like more sort of Yom Kippur on the individual cheshbon nefesh, and obviously like Tisha B'Av on the social and
that's
more general applications.
That's certainly part of it,
Yeah.
right? Who can eat is a question of when I think of the way I link myself to a collective and all those generations of memory and angst, and this in our current situation, you don't even need a long memory to think about a lot of anguish and pain. Whereas, as you say, on Yom Kippur, I'm personally trying to. There may be some pain involved in Yom Kippur, but I'm more focusing on myself and where I am and where I need to be.
Yeah.
So my third point is that one of the reasons I said I'd be fasting and I'll be fasting this year is because it serves as a reminder to me of the things that I take for granted. And when we live in a time, not very far from where we're sitting, there are people who don't know where their next meal is coming from, let alone in, distant places. And sadly, starvation and hunger has been a feature of the dramatic events of the last year. So that's another reason. I promise not to bore you with the whole thing, but I'll say I fast. I said my fourth point was because I'm wary of a Judaism which only likes the warm fuzzies and the happy endings, right? If all you ever want to do is cut out the difficult parts and just stick around for the highlights, that's not actually how life works or how culture works. And that I'm rather try to embrace the fullness of the thing.
Although I think Judaism really put actually a lot of focus on the terrible parts. I mean, right? I mean, we have some kind of collective tradition. Let's look back and see all the horrible things that have happened to us. We have to remember this. We have to relive them, right? It's like really focusing on the traumatic events of the past and to carry them with us.
Well, yes, although as the old joke has it, they tried to kill us, let's eat. With the trauma is the background and the trigger, but what we want to experience is the uplift.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can have the uplift without some downlift as well, if that's a word. Yeah. The fifth thing I said was that I'll be fasting, or I fast because all the other things I do to mark this day, thinking, reflecting, discussing, having this podcast, I do from the neck up, right? It's a cerebral activity,
intellectual,
right?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that actually this is a more somatic, full body, all in kind of experience. The last thing I said, which was true 13 years ago, which was when Tisha B'Av fell in the month of Ramadan, was that I was doing so in kind of solidarity. Now, that isn't the case in this particular year, but the issue of solidarity is still there, right? In the Muslim community, actually true in the fast days, also in Christianity, people, it's not only meant to be a wholly internal, introspective kind of activity. Can it not also be a trigger to some sort of broader human empathy? So that's a catalogue of reasons. You asked about my Tisha B'Av practice and you got more than you bargained for. This is to make sure you don't ask me any other questions about my practice.
Mike, I wanted to pick up on something that you said about sort of the early Reform Jews who didn't feel drawn to or wanted to sort of reject some of the tekes or the ritual around the whole mourning. And I'm wondering if it's something even more than that. The rejection of Tisha B'Av for the Reform movement was, the rejection of mourning the temple. And it's not, coincidental that we called our synagogue temples, and to say that this, we are actually rebuilding Judaism, and this is our temple, and this is it now. We're not looking to rebuild some temple, the third, and then the Zionist movement, basically led up to many people thinking about the state of Israel as the third commonwealth or the third temple, if it were. I remember Moshe Dayan, sort of famous or infamous, saying at the beginning of the Yom Kippur War that Zeh nafal beit shlishi, this is this is going to be the destruction of the third temple. Do you see that the state of Israel, or even the rebuilt Jerusalem, as we're sitting here, do you see it as representing the third temple? And if so, how does that impact our thought about previous destructions and what we're looking to rebuild?
Well, the simple answer to your question is no. I do not see the state of Israel as the third temple, and I'll tell you why I think it's a dangerous thing to do so. The more complicated answer is, well, first of all, I quite agree with you. The early reformers, you see this, for example, in the initial, in the Pittsburgh platform, the first one of the 1880s, where they quite deliberately state, these reform rabbis, most of them with a German background in America, saying, we do not yearn for the reinstitution of, the temple in Jerusalem. They did not yearn, most of those guys, those classical reformers, for a return to the Levant. It just seemed like, why would you possibly want to do such a crazy thing?
Ritual, and
there are days in which I understand. One can understand the sentiment. So, but when I say no, I don't think it's the third temple. Take a phrase which was coined shortly after the state came into existence, Reishit Tzmichat Geulateinu, which is translated variously as something like the first flowering of our redemption, or some such thing. And that appears in a blessing, perhaps coined by the then chief rabbi. Some suggested that Agnon, the great novelist, was involved, but it's probably more a couple of rabbis put it together. When you say of you ask God to bless the state of Israel, the first flowering of our redemption, actually that's a fairly hesitant statement. It's the first stirring of a redemptive process. Some rabbis later made it even more hesitant by saying, when they say the blessing, may God bless the state of Israel, may it yet be.
The future.
Debate. Do you add in the shetahei or not?
Now, you asked me a question. I've done a bit of bait and switch, because you asked me a question about the temple. The temple and redemption are different things, right? But there are, in this country today, many Jews whose vision of redemption is one in which there'll be a great big, from where we're sitting on King David Street, you'll be able to smell the sacrifices taking place on the temple. So there are folks who all too literally think that what redemption looks like is we get back to
wipe, of course, what there is now in the Mount.
Massive construction project.
And what goes along with that. Yes, don't worry, we won't be sitting at the Hebrew Union College on King David Street if the temple has been restored, because we'll also be swept away along the way. I think that regarding the state as a temple is a desperate confusion of religious and political categories, which only leads to grave outcomes. Do I think that Israel represents at its finest the possibility that it yet may one day be the first stirring of a redemptive process? I'm fine with that. But do I think Israel is the temple, and the third temple is Israel? I think we go at our peril, we go down that path.
Interesting. For me, when we're speaking about Tisha B'Av, right, two things come to mind, right? First of all, sinat chinam, right? Baseless hatred. And the other one is religious zealotry and extremism and what it brought it to. So I want those two. The first one about baseless hatred is something I'm struggling with, right? Because people are saying, oh, that's baseless hatred. And I'm saying that sometimes, and I think it's very present these days, there are things that are very dangerous that actually it's okay for us to feel appalled by, and not only that, to fight them, right? So, I mean, this whole phrase of baseless hatred is like something that is mysterious to me. What does it actually mean in the context of Tisha B'Av and in the current day context that we have so many people who are fighting our values, and we want to fight back. We want to be neutral and not say anything, right?
I was thinking about, I was at the Kotel actually on Friday night, and I had this deja vu, or this, sort of a flashback actually of one of a very unpleasant altercation on one of the Rosh Chodesh in which we were there early in the morning.
Just had last week.
Yeah.
Chodesh.
And I, sort of flippantly blamed someone of, sinat chinam. And he returned back to me. He goes, "No, my hatred is not baseless at all." He goes,
That's a very strong base.
It's a very strong מבוסס. He goes, "אני לא חינם בכלל, אני שונא אותך." He's like, "I hate you." Plain. So, whether it's baseless or not, but we're feeling that, I think, a lot in places.
There, love and hate have been weaponized in our current environment. There's people who'll give you a sermon about baseless hatred, and I've given several, God knows. You always need to ask who falls within the force field of their love and who of their hatred. The best reading of Sinat Chinam I have heard was by a conservative rabbi, Chaya Weinberg, at a gathering at the president's house.
Yeah, I was there. It was brilliant.
Brilliant. What she said, it only works really in Hebrew, but I'll try and translate it. Sinat chinam shel acherim. What you hate is the chen, the grace, the beauty that you may fleetingly identify in the other. It's a kind of psychological reading. It's rather than saying you shouldn't go around having, baseless hatred for people. It implies that some of the things that gets us most riled up and most angry is that we sometimes will look at the other with a degree of jealousy or admiration that we don't quite know what to do with. Look, in my general experience, the whole question of hatred, baseless or otherwise, is as much a personality trait as it is to do. Again, it's not from the neck up. You decide you're going to hate something or not going to hate something. Outrage is different from hatred. Protest, response, mobilization, this, it seems to me, we must do. Okay? Hatred, when you get to the point that when a particular individual or somebody embodying a particular attitude, all that appears is a kind of white mist of hatred, society does not function well when that's the fuel that is driving it. And God knows, in the last years in this country, before October 7th, we were already getting there. One is confronted with people with attitudes, which of what this society ought to look like and what humanity looks like, which is so at odds with one's own approach that simply saying, "Isn't it lovely and we're all brothers and sisters and let's sing Kumbaya," that is not going to work. I don't think that, put it like this, I wouldn't prescribe hatred. Hatred is not a strategy. I think interrogating one's own rage and working out how one can translate this rage into channel it into action, whilst it seems to me maintaining as much the dignity of the other, including the other with whom I do not agree, is something I try to preserve in all in all situations.
And I think there's something that in both societies, both Israeli and American, two very polarized societies, is something a lot of people struggle with these days. How to have this, constructive dialogue and arguments without, as you say, sort of compromising the dignity of the person you don't agree with.
I mean, I'll give you a practical example. Last week, I think it was last week or the week before, I was out not far from Jerusalem in a doing some protective presence stuff at our organization.
See, you said you were sitting on the couch. You were going out there and doing stuff.
Yeah. Well, I was also sitting there. A lot of the day I was sitting in a Bedouin encampment, sitting on a less less well upholstered couch. But I was, believe
Without
me,
air conditioning.
believe me, there's never been an activity where I haven't sought out a couch. I don't know. Anyway, so there I was, and what you sit there for hours, perspiring for peace, is that what you might call, and eventually some guy, an Israeli guy, as far as I could work out, the story of this young man, he's probably comes from a troubled background somewhere in mainland Israel, you might say, who's been brought in. He's living on a chavah, on a farm settlement, and takes a herd of goats. My understanding is many of those goats. It's not clear what the original ownership of the herd is, but his job is to move it from one place to another. And every day he comes past this Bedouin settlement where we were, and checks the gate and the walls, and shakes them up a bit to intimidate the folks who were there. So when I look into the eyes of this young man, the few people I was with tried to sort of engage him in conversation. He wasn't the biggest. I wouldn't invite him to the podcast necessarily, although that might be interesting. That might be interesting. But when I looked into his eyes, it certainly wasn't hatred that I felt. It was a great deal of despair about what the situation we've all got into, where so many resources are being poured into taking this kid from his life and making he's quite clearly convinced that he's doing God's work and preserving it's us or them as far as he's concerned. And I can't say that it's hatred. I don't find that term covers what it is that I feel. But that doesn't mean that the only alternative is I feel lovely, warm, happy feelings. I do not.
But I think this really raises an important question, and that goes to zealotry, the religious zealotry thing. And I think as you said today, that a lot of people talk about unity and we're all brothers, sisters, and everybody should be under one big tent. I think that one of the messages of Tisha B'Av is that the dangers of zealotry that could take the tent down or the temple down, right? And I think that what is important for me is to make people understand there are boundaries beyond which some people cannot be our partners, not even for a discussion or for constructive argument, because they embody this really dangerous zealotry that is going to bring us down. And I think we've really experienced it with the people in power in our government, that their values are in complete contradiction.
And not only that, but the zealotry that's in the name of Judaism.
Yeah.
And saying, no, our interpretation of Judaism and Jewish law compels us to commit serious violence, that it's okay for me to steal as long as it's against a non-Jew. I can take his flock. It's okay for me to, rampage through villages and intimidate people. And how do we respond to that? I think, we're seeing this, and the situation that you described, Michael, with that individual, if I were to put it in another context, it seems like people who have joined gangs or joined cults even, to look for something, and they're totally convinced that this is what maybe God wants of them, or the other people, inspiring people want of them. And we're seeing that escalate on a level that's no longer just a few wayward lost souls, but really has some support from people in power.
Well, and more than that, your tax shekels, all your tax dollars are going towards enabling and supporting this guy. It's not just that there are the issue about political leadership and so forth. Sitting in synagogue on Shabbat, the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av, and listening to the words of the prophet Yeshayahu, who I would, Isaiah in the proper English pronunciation, or Isaiah for our American viewers, and you realize that if you ask the question about should religion and politics be mixed, Sarayich sorim v'chavrei ganavim, kulo ohev shochad v'rodef shalmonim. Your rulers are rogues and cronies of thieves, everyone avid for presents and greedy for gifts. They do not judge the case of the orphan, and the widow's cause never reaches them. Part of the story of Tisha B'Av is this prophetic voice It's an unrelenting, unforgiving, prophetic voice, which is prepared to call out the injustices as they're seen. Now, I think a corollary or a condition of that is if all one does is spend one's time pointing one finger at the other guy and saying how bad they've fallen, then that's just pompous and not serious. I think a religious approach is one where we have to use the same withering critique upon ourselves. Usually very good at doing that.
We need Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. I mean, we need both of those.
Right. But even I want to say within the dynamic of Tisha B'Av, right? Mipnei chataenu galinu ma'artzenu, our sins, we are...
Because our sins we are exiled.
I guess what I'm trying to do is walk a line here. I don't want to go into the banal space of everybody's as bad as everybody else and everybody's as good. That's not true. That's not true. According to my moral compass, there are opinions and activities and policies which represent the worst of, the antithesis of all the things that I believe in. And I have, no problem saying that. The line I'm trying to draw is, on the other hand, becoming this very judgmental person who goes around saying you're no good and you're no good, and only I with my particular. But I want to say something that people don't often think about with regards to Tisha B'Av. One of the great unspoken themes of the Book of Lamentations is the alphabet. Now, I am a big lover of the alphabet. The book you promoted earlier is all about the alphabet. But here's the thing:
open access. It's free online.
It's free, and and the alphabet is freely available to anybody.
As well.
The Book of Lamentations is an alphabetical book.
Mm.
Of all the chapters of the book are in conversation with the alphabet. Most of the chapters go in alphabetical order. One of the chapters has got 3 aleph, 3 bets, 3 gimels. And the last chapter of the book, you think, looks like free verse. It isn't alphabetical. But how many verses are there in the chapter? 22. It's all in conversation with the alphabet. All in conversation with the alphabet. Why do I mention this here? An alphabet is, by its nature, it's meant to, it's an encompassing thing, right? If we're going to cope with the complexity of what we're in, if all you have in your alphabet is one letter, if you have one theme, one tone, one melody, you don't capture the complexity of it, right? And when this lamentation this work of mourning uses the alphabet, it tries to say, how should I count the ways? I need to use all the alphabet of my emotions and my beliefs and my analyses to try and capture it. So I'm always suspicious of somebody who has the one clear understanding of what all our problems are. It's an alphabet of grief.
No, I understand it, but I think that in our current atmosphere, when we're living in such a chaotic reality, I think it's actually important, and it is our responsibility to say, yes, there is right and wrong, there is black and white, and some of the things that we're seeing are terribly wrong, and it's very hard to find one right thing that, for instance, the Israeli government is doing, and it's our responsibility to call it out as wrong and to present the alternative of what we think should be going on from the Jewish perspective. And I think that looking in our resources, we can find both the values that we believe in, but also terrible things that some of our people in power today are using Judaism to promote hatred and exclusion. And we should call this out.
I don't disagree with you. I think maybe there's a difference in tone. We can state till tomorrow that there's right and wrong and there's black and white, but we also live all the time in shades of gray of different kinds. Every so often, something happens in the world which helps remind me, at least, that however much I want to look for an alphabet in a range of possibilities, sometimes it's just this is too much. It's described by the great thinker Weber over 100 years ago, talks about this notion of an ethic of responsibility, that sometimes you get to a point where you just say, here I stand, I can do no other. If to be explicit for a moment, if some of the things that Itamar Ben-Gvir says about Jews and Arabs and about the system of justice and all, if some of those things are true, then everything that I believe in is a lie, right? And so it helps clarify. But most of the time, one lives in a world in which, even with folks who espouse opinions very different from my own, I'm often trying to work out how did they get to where they are, and what's different about me, and what do I have to learn? In other words, it's not. I think that we should be cautious in adopting these positions sometimes. So you're talking about zealotry before. Zealotry is an equal opportunity employer. There are people who can be zealous in all sorts of ways. And once you get into the dynamic where you say, well, I'm clearly right, which means you're clearly wrong, that you go through life in this kind of binary way of looking at the world. I'm much more about the alphabet. So I want to say, what are the range of things? And the fact that even, let's take Itamar Ben-Gvir, okay? To my great shame, we belong to the same people. I mean, he feels the same about me. It's okay. It's okay. It's mutual.
Even though we don't die at the same shul.
Right.
Yeah.
But we are part, I had a conversation at that same protected presence thing, where I spoke to one of the Bedouin folks who had been in the village, and he had been shot in last December by some of these people from one of the new farms who'd come down to show who was boss. And I said something like, I felt, he said to me as I was leaving that he was sorry that we'd had to spend the day doing this. And I said, I feel,
I'm sorry.
you're sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. And then we got talking about
Sorry.
these extremists. And I said to them, which is the truth, I have a deep sense of identification with these people. I'm now not talking about the Ben-Gvirs of this world. I am appalled by what they say, but I do feel connected, nationally, or however you want to say this. And that forces me often to ask myself, how do these dynamics of zealotry and extremism, how do they play out? We need to be strong enough, I completely agree with you, to face down this threat. We can't, we should learn from the prophet Isaiah. I believe it was translated for your benefit. We should learn that sometimes you just have to call it out.
Yes.
But I think we should be cautious in making everything into a black and white question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's interesting. The question of, black and white. I want to build on that a little bit, is that when we look at Tisha B'Av traditionally, we tend to say, this is a thing that happened to us. Whether it was the first temple, the second temple, all the things that they, built onto the day, this happened to us. And our modern day Churban of October 7th, or Simchat Torah, is a thing that happened to us. And this needs to be a moment about our own mourning, our own story, going into ourselves as a community, as a people, and meantime, other people are suffering. Sometimes suffering that we caused also, whether it's in response to destruction or not. So how do we reconcile that? Can we both mourn our own story, on our own fate, as it were, and also say, wait a second, there's great suffering that's going on right now, not far from us, as you pointed out with the Bedouin, but also, let's name it, Gaza right now. And how do we, rationalize that as Jews to say, okay, maybe this is about us, and maybe this is a moment for us to be not only about ourselves.
And I think a lot of people in North America are struggling with that, both
on both sides, by the way.
Right.
I mean, we get it. We have people who are telling us this needs to be about us and us only. And other people saying to us, this cannot be about us at all. Look at what's happening. And, I have my opinions, but it's a big question, I think. Yeah.
I'll tell you my favorite verse in the book of Lamentations, since you didn't ask.
Yeah. What is your favorite verse?
Habitu uru'u im yesh machov kemach'ovi.
Yeah.
Look and see if there is any pain like my pain. That is an expression of a person in the grip of absolute grief. There's never been a pain like this pain. Now, here's what I want to say. Yesh mach'ov kemach'ovi. there is pain like my pain. And there are individuals who, in the specificity of their pain and grief, can find a way of identifying with the pain and grief of the other, including, and we have to say this, pain and grief that we were agents of, that we caused, maybe even, this is hard for people to hear, in a disproportionate and inappropriate way, okay, in an unjustifiable way. There is something comforting when you say, look and see if there's any pain like my pain. That's the end of the discussion. Don't talk to me now. I'm in my pain. And I must say, knowing folks who have had to pay, the ultimate price in the course of these last dreadful years, there is a kind of force field of grief around them, and who is anybody else to tell them anything? But we as a society, we as a people, we as a collective need to reflect on what that dynamic means. Once you get into there's no pain like my pain, you have a license for blindness. And once you have a license for blindness, you're only going to get more deeper into this dynamic. So what I love about that, I once suggested to my colleagues in Maram, the rabbinical assembly here in Israel, that we make it our motto for the institution. Because sometimes when we're sitting around like in it's the rabbis' trades union, sometimes the conversations are a bit like that. You think that's bad? Let me tell you what it's like for me. And it's true of any group. It's part of what brings you together or to cohere. But I think the challenge, I think it's a religious challenge and a moral challenge, is what does it mean to face up to one's specific pain and realize that someone not very far away from you is in the grip of a dreadful pain, right? And it's not a competition, right?
Exactly. I think to Israelis, what happened after October 7th, because the catastrophe was so widespread and really touched on everyone, I think people experienced it like never before. And I think it took a lot of people some time to go beyond our pain and to look outside. I can tell you that for me, it was a very scary experience because it took like for the first 2 weeks, I felt I can't look at anybody but my people's pain. And it was scary because I've never felt this before. So for me, it took a few weeks. For a lot of people, it took months and years. And that's on one sense understandable because of the magnitude of the trauma. But I exactly like you're saying, Marmur, I think the message is that it's not pain Olympics, and you can care for your people pain and for others people pain, and one does not negate the other. I think I really felt it also around the Israeli-Palestinian memorial ceremony, which was screened in Ra'anana, and the Reform Synagogue, and I was hurt. And I think the feelings that people feel about this
Just to remind
ceremony.
people, you were injured by a mob.
But I think that the ceremony itself, it is so debatable because people say, no, we should focus on our pain and not talk at all about other people's pain because one negates the other. And this is such an important concept to break in order for us to really have a breakthrough.
And with that, Tisha B'Av, I think is important because we have people, and I'm talking, wearing my North American lens here, who are unable to see our own pain at all, and are only looking at the pain of the other, and to say, you are inflicting pain and they are experiencing pain, and not able to understand it. And I don't want to say even in context, but to say, wait a second, yes, Kelvin Kemachufai, like there are, I am in pain, and I think we, being here in Israel now, is seeing, and several times over the last few years, is a society that's in trauma right now. Some say the Jewish people are in trauma, whether it's from the destruction of the temple or from the Shoah or from October 7th, but we're traumatized. And I think you put it beautifully. Does that leave us blind to the other?
I think we're reaching to the close. Unfortunately, we wanted to continue to speak with you until Tisha B'Av and beyond.
But maybe just to conclude, Michael, would you be willing to just maybe share a few thoughts, or I don't know if advice, or to say, a lot of people are struggling, and I think Tisha B'Av is a day that puts the focus on Jerusalem and puts the focus on the destruction and sort of the a phrase that we mentioned at the conference yesterday on the lachrymose history of the Jewish people. And people are struggling to figure out how they should feel, what they should do, and how can we use this moment to help us, think about these things in a different way, or potentially move forward with how we should be thinking, feeling, and acting.
And we're at the very end of the episode, so you must give us hopefulness.
Yes.
Well,
I
I heard a brilliant talk by our colleague Noah Satat last week, and she said something
just
that
to say that Noah's the director.
Noah Satat, who the first thing to say about her
Yeah.
is that she's a rabbi, graduate of Hebrew Union College, but she also, as a side hustle, is the in charge of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, and a very influential, important person who worked for many
Former
years,
director of
former
IRA.
director of IRA money. And
School,
she responded to what everybody wants in these talks, which is show us the hope. Where's the hope? Give me the hope. And she said something brilliant, and probably she's good when she comes and you interview her and she says this thing. Say, oh no, that's old news. Michael Marmur said that already.
Yeah.
But she said something brilliant, which was, people overemphasize the hope thing because I'm paraphrasing, obviously. She says, I got to tell you, I don't have hope every day, but here's what I do have every day. I have responsibility. I have agency. And that's the thing that gets me. If you want, again, the nice, warm, fuzzy feeling of a up and atom, Tisha B'Av is not that kind of a day, I want to tell you.
Not really.
Tisha B'Av, it is true that as the day of Tisha B'Av unfolds ritually, it's been built in such a way, those who put tefillin on a regular basis will put them on later in the day. You kind of lean in, and then we have the haftarot of consolation. We do a lot more consolation than we do because there's only a limited amount of hardcore grief that we can put up with.
Ours is not Ramadan.
I know that you wanted me to give a nice, up and atom ending, and I want to tell you, I don't think that's appropriate. Not appropriate for Tisha B'Av, not appropriate for the crisis that we're in, which is a very major crisis. But not being able to give you a message of a hope is not the same as paralysis. It's not the same as saying, when therefore it's all lost. No, we maybe a good thing to do on Tisha B'Av, whatever your nutritional regime is on that day. Everybody does what they do. Maybe a good thing to do with Tisha B'Av is to ask, what is the agency that I have? What is the capacity I have to do something in the world? And what matters to me most? That's an appropriate way of marking this day.
Well, thank you, Michael. I
Thank
actually
you so
take
much.
hope from listening to you
Yeah.
and from learning.
Absolutely.
And I think giving a thought to all those issues on Tisha B'Av is tremendously important, especially at this time. So thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for being in my office.
And really, conversations like this are exactly why we started this podcast. This podcast exists because we believe Israel can be better for all who live here and for all who care about it from afar. But that takes honest conversation and it takes partnership. So if these conversations are important to you, please share this episode and help us keep the conversation going.
To stay up to date, subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to help us grow, go in and make an engaging post on social media. Leave us a 5-star review and say something like, wow, until I listened to this podcast, I didn't know that there could be other pain like my pain. You don't have to use that verbatim, but you could make a post and please share this with someone who you think might be interested. Feel free to sponsor one of these episodes. And we look forward to the next episode.
Thank you.
Toda rabba.
Bye-bye.